Alferd Packer, sometimes called Alfred Packer, was an epileptic Civil War veteran, prospector, and self-proclaimed wilderness guide in the Old West. He is infamous for the gruesome activities that took place during an expedition he accompanied through the Rocky Mountains in the winter of 1874. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Packer was born in Pennsylvania in 1842. His family moved to Indiana in the early 1850s, and around the age of 20, he joined the Union Army, enlisting in 1862 in Minnesota. He was honorably discharged due to epilepsy 8 months later, then re-enlisted again in Iowa in 1863, but was relieved of duty for a second time in April 1864 for the same reason. He traveled further and further west, taking on many different labor jobs, but his epileptic seizures and overall attitude were not ideal. Eventually, he entered into the mining industry, drifting from mine to mine. After no success, he moved on to Utah. By most accounts, Packer was generally disliked and distrusted, and was known to steal. Just as modern researchers conclude, most of Packer's contemporaries also had the impression that he was a nearly pathological liar. The story gets interesting in November 1873, near Provo, Utah, when Packer encountered Bob McGrew's party of about 21 men heading for the gold country around Breckenridge, Colorado. Word had spread of a new gold strike, and Packer claimed to be an expert guide and prospector and have first-hand knowledge of the Breckenridge area. He had no supplies or money and only a Colt 6-shooter. The group soon realized that his claims were fabricated. One member of the group later called him a whiny fraud. Unfortunately for the group, the winter of 1873 and 74 was unusually harsh. After 3 months of difficult travel along the snow-laden Morin Trail, the party staggered into the camp of the Ute Indian chief Ouray, near Montrose, Colorado. It was the end of January 1874 by now, and Chief Ouray recommended they postpone their expedition until spring, since they were likely to encounter dangerous winter weather in the mountains, and offered to allow the men to stay with his tribe until the winter had passed, saying that no Ute would attempt the journey because of the danger. After discussion and a fear of missing the gold rush, 11 men decided to proceed on. They would first travel to the Los Pinos Indian Agency, the closest outpost to the camp, and then proceed onward to Breckenridge. Chief Ouray saw that there was no changing the men's minds, and gave them food for their journey, as well as safe directions that bypassed the mountains. Packer was in favor of getting to the agency faster by going through the mountains, stating it was a more direct route. Most of the men were in favor of following the Gunnison River along its banks, but Packer insisted that he knew the country well and that his way was quicker, eventually securing 5 men to follow him. The other half of that group stayed the river route and ran out of supplies about midway, but were rescued near starvation by a few local ranch workers. On February 9th, Packer and the 5 others in his party set off, intending to traverse the mountains. Besides Packer, the group comprised of Shannon Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, George California Noon, and Israel Swan. The men in Packer's party had a 75-mile journey ahead of them. The leader of the combined parties, Bob McGrew, guided Packer's party along the river route, advised by Chief Urey, until his horses could not continue, when he unloaded the men's provisions and went back to Urey's camp. Packer and the other men continued along the river for a time, before Packer took his party on a path higher up in the San Juan Mountains, disregarding Urey's ominous warning. This decision was made when the men barely had enough food to cover the supposed 14 days it would take, possessed no snowshoes, had a bare minimum of matches and no flint, and also had no heavy clothing that would combat the extreme cold. They went into the mountains with 2 rifles, 1 pistol, a couple knives, a hatchet, and minimal ammunition. What happened after this is not exactly clear. 2 months later, on April 16, 1874, Packer emerged from the woods alone and stumbled his way across a frozen lake bed to the Los Pinos Indian Agency near Saguache, Colorado, with rags on his feet. As the men of the agency sat around the table, the door was flung open, and Packer stood before them, begging for food and shelter. Packer left after 10 days, saying that he wished to return to Pennsylvania, and then headed to the nearby town of Saguache to buy supplies for his journey. Preston Nutter, a member of the original party who remained at the Urey camp, arrived in Saguache around this time with 2 other original party members. He encountered Packer in Dolan's saloon, drinking and carrying on, and questioned him about his story. Meanwhile, back at the Los Pinos Indian Agency, 2 men of the 5-man party that had taken the Gunnison River route before being rescued finally arrived at their destination. They were joined a few days later by the remaining 3 men. When General Charles Adams, a former Confederate Army colonel and grandfather to Helen Keller, relayed Packer's story to the men, all 5 of them at once discredited what Packer had told him and his staff, stating that the men they had known would never abandon a man to die. Lotzenheiser flatly told General Adams that Packer was not to be trusted and that he was sure that something bad had happened in the mountains. A party was formed to locate the crime scene and any bodies. As they approached the supposed site, Packer claimed to become lost. While the party was returning to the fort, Packer unexpectedly attempted to murder Louder, the leader of the group. This display cost Packer any remaining credibility with the officials. After their return to the base, Packer was detained. It was then he signed his first confession, which was approximately the 5th version of his story. Later, he even changed the details of this signed confession. The following August, the site of the incident was found by a reporter for Harper's Weekly magazine. Sadly, thanks to Packer's utter lack of experience, the group was literally only 2 miles from a small town. While this was happening, Packer was escaping jail. The jail in question was little more than a log cabin located on ranch property. Packer never divulged who helped him escape. In 1883, about 10 years later, Packer was discovered by John Frenchy Cabazon in Cheyenne, Wyoming, living under the alias of John Schwartz. Cabazon reported Packer to the local sheriff, who apprehended him and contacted General Adams. Packer claimed to have fled the Sawatch area to avoid the locals killing him. Packer was taken to Denver, where he created his second signed confession. Packer's lawyers were able to appeal the finding due to Colorado changing from a territory to a state. In his next trial, he again pleaded not guilty. After a swift trial, on June 8, 1886, Packer was convicted of 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 40 years in prison. At the time, this was the longest custodial sentence in U.S. history, and he was sent to serve out his sentence at the Canyon City Penitentiary. 2 years later, he received parole, having been helped by a friend and a Denver Post reporter named Dolly Pry. After his parole, Packer went to work as a guard at the Denver Post, and later as a ranch hand. His employment at the Post came about, many believe, as a direct result of the reporter Pry and her employers securing his release. Packer had an endearing respect for Pry for his remaining years and referred to her as his liberator. Alferd Packer died on April 23, 1907, at the age of 65, in Deer Creek, Colorado, and was later interred in Littleton, Colorado. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you found some value. Be sure to check the description for links to cool videos, and also make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next video. Have a good day.